Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. We are going to start with some birthdays. This week we have Kim's birthday, so we're going to sing happy birthday to Kim. Everybody ready?
Yep.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Kim. Happy
Happy
birthday to
birthday to you.
Woo! Happy birthday, Kim.
Thank you.
And we're going to do some worship. So if you haven't already, go ahead and mute your microphones. I'm going to make a slight adjustment to the sound so that my guitar doesn't garble. Hopefully this works. We've been playing with settings, trying to make it work. And Courtney's going to do the words for us. So. That's the whole song. I will rejoice, for you are my Savior, the one that I love. There is no other, and I rest assured in the strength of your kingdom, the promise of hope, of life and of freedom. How great you are. Can you sing it to speaker? I will rejoice, for you are my Savior, the one that I love. There is no other, and I rest assured in the strength of your kingdom, your promise of hope, of life and of freedom. How great you are. Great are your ways, Lord, righteous and true. Rich is your mercy, there's no one like you. And your loving kindness shines like the stars over all of creation. How great you are. I will rejoice, for you are my Savior, the one that I love. There is no other, and I rest assured in the strength of your kingdom, your promise of hope, of life and of freedom. How great you are. Great are your ways, Lord, righteous and true. Rich is your mercy, there's no one like you. Your loving kindness shines like the stars over all of creation. How great you are. Great are your ways. Great are your ways, Lord, righteous and true. Rich is your mercy, there's no one like you. Your loving kindness shines like the stars over all of creation. How great you are over all of creation. How great you are. Great are your ways. Great are your ways, Lord, righteous and true. Rich is your mercy, there's no one like you. And your loving kindness shines like the stars over all of creation. How great you are. But I just feel like that song encompasses everything we've been talking about for weeks now. We just pray for you to show your face and let your kingdom come. And we give you our hearts, and we pray that our lives would be a sacrifice and would represent you well in these times. Amen.
Morning, everybody. I guess you can't say good morning back and even have me hear it because you're all muted.
Good morning.
Good morning.
There you go. There you go. Everybody,
Hi.
everybody unmute and say hello to everybody.
Hey, Maria, good to see you.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
We're unmutated now.
Yeah.
Philip.
Thank you, Philip.
Hi. I'm late to the game. Just figured out where the button is.
Well, we'll get started here. I think after last week I spoke and then kind of ended it. Linda kept on after. I don't know what happened, but I'm going to go back to. I'm not in a bad. I don't know what happened because I wasn't there. so I don't know what really. That's not as dangerous as leaving Jim in control, but still, Linda's been known. So 2 weeks ago, I think after Katie spoke, we kind of left it open for people to make comments if they wanted to, and I think that we'll try to do that again today because the Zoom it lends itself to Zoom. And last week I was kind of more prepared just to speak like normal because I finished off that series. And but this week I'm going to be freestyling it a little bit. It's interesting when I've taken one of these, I don't know if you've heard of Strength Finders, but basically it's you take it and it shows you what your strengths are, kind of like not just a temperament test, but this thing has so many different things that you could be I've never heard of, but my number one gifting was connectedness, which again, I had never even heard that, but I have, it's not just that I like to be connected to people and things, but it comes naturally to me that to have the things that happen in my life, I see connection between them. And so even as we're singing these songs and the things that are in my mind about what to talk about, to me, they just stick out. To a lot of people they do, but to some people they don't. But you could probably use that last song as at least part of it as a long title sermon to my freestyle today. Lord, you have my heart and I will search for yours. Let me be for you a sacrifice. I'm going to be talking about kind of all those things in a little way because I want to talk about searching for God's heart of what he's saying to us or wants us to look at this time where the world's kind of halted for a lot of us. Some people's more so than others, but probably for everybody to some extent, we could say the world is kind of slowed down, if not stopped, and it's not a good thing. But I think as I began to engage with God on this, he reminded me that whether good things come or bad things come, God is God. He's the God of creation. He's how great he is. And he is at work. Even so, even when the worst thing you could think would happen, people putting Jesus on a cross, God was actually making that become the greatest thing that ever happened. So even in this time of lockdown, he's doing stuff, he is doing stuff, and he's inviting us into some stuff if we would search for it. And part of it means being a sacrifice, going back to death to self. And that was kind of the first thing I wanted to state, was that kind of after having gone a year and a half or so on the Life Without Lack, a Life Without Fear set of series, that in my mind, I think that we probably will for the rest of our lives have everything that we do in our Christian life, in our following Jesus, everything that we will ever talk about falls within the things that we've talked about over the last year and a half, as far as this life, whether it be how great God is, and learning that more and more and more, about learning how valuable not just I am, but you are, and everybody is, just by fact of being a human being created in God's image. And how as I learn more and more and more about that, I will begin to treat people more and more and more the way that I ought to, even my enemies. There's more growth in understanding that we have an enemy, and although he's defeated, he is very much at work, and he's in charge of a lot of stuff around us. And I should not be ignorant of that in life. And as I understand that more and more, as I recognize stuff, I know what to do and what not to do. And then more on the micro part of life is spending on the inside of me, is growing in my faith, growing my faith, my death to self, and love, which some of those topics we'll touch on today. But I wanted to read just this little quote out. I'm going to be freestyling. I think I said I've got a number of quotes and a story or two, which will help keep me in line with the things that I'm, so that there's a starting place and an ending place. But just know that over the last week and a half, God's really been dealing with me on this other thing, of which I've got many thoughts of, which this is just kind of laying some stuff out there, which will probably end up being a theme for at least a little while. But yeah, there's this book called, if you remember, Brant Hansen wrote a book that a number of us read a couple of years ago called Unoffendable. And a lot of us who went through the Getting Rid of Anger class that we did down at the church on Thursday nights, I think it was, use that as a launching pad. And it's a great book. He's kind of a funny guy. That's why I like him. He's an easy read, simple read, and self-deprecating guy. And yet he's very good at pointing out really deep truths. And I wanted to read this quote only for two reasons. One, it's called The Truth About Us. It's a new, that looks like it's backwards. The writing's backwards on my computer, so you probably can't read that. But two reasons. One, I was told about it and suggested to read it by Sam Huckabee. And this is my segue into letting everybody know that the Huckabees are moving to Denver. Actually, Sam is he's on his way right now, this very moment. He's driving one of his vehicles with a bunch of stuff out there. And then in 2 weekends, they'll move out there. And I think that because the fact that his job has projects in California and Ann's parents live in Manteca, that they'll probably still come back a few times a year, but they are moving. So I don't know if you want to reach out to them and say something or whatever, it'd be really good. But it's interesting as we get into this death to self and kind of what we'll be talking about in a little bit about this is God's church and not my church or not your church. We're a part of God. We've been invited into God's family, and God's the one who says, this is what my family is supposed to look like, and this is what is important in my family, and he's the king. He's the one who gets to decide that stuff, and it's up to us to in faith, trusting that he knows what's best, because he's the guy who created it all, to when we don't understand or we don't agree because we have our own ideas, is to die to ourselves and to say, okay, God, I don't want the Huckabees to leave. I don't want there's a lot of things I don't want to happen, but, and whether people make the right decisions and I think that they laid it out before God. And I think that's really good, but I mean, it's a good thing for them, but I don't like it because I'd rather have them here. And, but it's God's kingdom. As John Wimber used to say, I'm just a nickel in God's pocket, and he can spend me however he wants. And so are the Huckabees, and so are you. And so especially as long as people are seeking after God's will for what they should be doing, I have to trust that this is the best thing, and loving people is wanting the best thing for them, right? And if they're doing what God wants them to do, that's the best thing, whether there's pain or not. So that was just kind of a good way to let everybody know, because with the way things are now, a lot of information is not getting out because we don't see each other. But this is this. I don't remember how I got here, because I just started the book, but at the very end there's a thing that's talking about loving your enemies. So it kind of stood out. So I just want to read this thing. It says, because we've been talking a lot about love your enemies. It's kind of the benchmark, so to speak, of the kingdom, and always has been. And it says, it just so happens that love your enemies was apparently one of the most popular, oft repeated things that Jesus said among early believers. Writer Preston Sprinkle notes it was quoted in 26 places by 10 different writers in the first 300 years of Christianity, which makes it the most celebrated command among the first Christians. Then he says, I don't think it's been celebrated much since then. And then he goes, there's a book called The 100, a ranking of the most influential persons in history. When I found it, I knew it would be arbitrary, but I like rankings and lists. So I wondered where Jesus would finish. So I opened it up. Jesus finishes at number 3. It says, Muhammad gets the number 1 seed, and Isaac Newton checks in right behind him. Now, to be sure, billions of humans, including me, have believed that Jesus rose from the dead. He's also the central flashpoint of history. We even date things according to his life. In my opinion, that trumps Newton's contributions to physics and even his pioneering work in fig-based snack cookies, which is where I know more about him, because I know nothing about physics. The author of The 100 said he would have given Jesus the top spot, but for one of Jesus's teachings, both breathtaking and scandalous. Love your enemies. He says if that one had caught on, he says Jesus would have been number 1, no problem, but it didn't catch on. The author has a fair point. It's been 2,000 plus years, and if aliens landed on Earth, I doubt they'd look at our history and say, you know what you guys are really good at? Loving your enemies. He says, then they could say, now let us help you with your overpriced coffee issue. It's tragic because loving our enemies is an antidote to the poison of self-righteousness. It requires a renovated heart. It requires obedience. It's an act of worship before God. It puts our self-love in a healthy place under his kingship. And yes, it's a struggle to love our enemies, but it's a heroic one. Loving ourselves, we're natural at that. Loving our enemies, wanting them to flourish in spite of themselves, now we're talking about something glorious, something that's less like me and more like Jesus. And so, we kind of been using the definition of loving somebody as to wish and to want the best thing for them. But I liked it when he said that loving our enemies, wanting them to flourish in spite of themselves. I think that we have a hard time, or we go to, I want to be able to love my enemies in spite of what they've done to me, in spite of the bad things that they do to other people. But this actually even gets closer to what we've been talking about. In spite of themselves, I want to help them become better people in spite of themselves. And then he says, that's something that's less like me and more like Jesus. And that kind of leads into what I'm talking about today. Again, it is all connected in the kingdom, but this looking less like me and more like Jesus. And God's kind of been stirring something, like I said, in my heart for the past week or so. And I think it it kind of began with a statement I heard a couple different places, or I heard it or read it, and it's kind of people talking about why, you know, the whole idea of churches not meeting right now, and it's almost like there's some people that they make the statement like, you don't need a building to worship, meaning what's the big deal? And many of those people aren't Christians, which of course people who aren't Christians, like everybody, has an idea of what everybody else believes and it is important to them. I know a lot of people who aren't Christians that could tell you exactly what the church ought to be doing and what they're doing that they ought not to do, and yet they have no idea what the church really is. But that also, it comes from some people that are Christians. And I began to think about that statement, you don't need a building to worship God. And I think that we all, at least all of us, understand that there's nothing sacred in the building, but there is something sacred in what the building does. And the building is a place where the church gathers. The church was created not necessarily to have a sacred building, but the church was created to be to get together, to live together, to spend time together. And whether it's a building today, or at one time the early church met in houses, but they also met in the temple during the day, and then they would meet in houses at night. And then when Christianity spread to the non-Jewish world, they met in catacombs and in houses and down by the river and in a van. No, I don't think that they had the van, but down by the river, Paul went to meet with some people, you know, because he knew down by the river he would find Christians. There was something about being down by water, but there's always been a place where people meet, and where we are feeling it the most, because we were created to be together, is we're not together. And that's why even having Zoom is better than not having Zoom. But and when we first get on Zoom, it's like, hey, it's great to see everybody's face. But after a few weeks of this, we kind of go, but I don't want to go back, but it's not it's not the same. It's not the same as not just sitting in a building, because again, church isn't just about Sunday morning, although that's what comes to our mind. It's sitting over at the Yanniconi's house, who are like the best, most hospitable people in the world. Not a lot of people are, but I tell you, if you haven't been to the Yanniconi's house for dinner, they put on an awesome spread. They put on they're great hosts. They make you feel at home. You talk about everything that's on your heart, and you also talk about the things of the kingdom. They are, you just don't talk about baseball and the weather. You talk about important things, and both of them are really, really good at that. And those are the things that you just miss the getting together. And so in my process, I began to go, I hate you, lockdown, you know, and Vine. And what came to my mind was that what I just said was that even this hasn't taken God by surprise, of course, but not only has it not taken him by surprise, he's doing this thing. He's working undercover, doing some awesome things, not just getting by, not just saying, okay, we'll use this time to go through our closets and clean out all the stuff that we don't really need. But in a sense, that's what I think he's doing. He's saying, okay, everybody's kind of slowed down. You kind of need to go through your closets and clean out all the clothes you don't wear, the stuff that's not in style. You've got, 35 pairs of shoes. There are people that don't have any shoes. Maybe you need to take some of your shoes and give them to some people. But it's a matter of taking the time when things have kind of stopped and finding out what life is really about. Because whenever I have some deep conversations with people, we all kind of go to the things that I'm realizing this is important. Just being together, that's really important. This is really important. And there's really not that these other things are non-important, but comparatively, these things are the most important. And yet, when everything is going full bore, those things, you wouldn't know those were the most important things because they're crowded out of a lot of stuff by all the extra pairs of shoes and shirts I have in my closet. And so I can't get to the really good stuff. So as I began to think this through, I began to say, okay, God, so if this is a time for us to look at what we're doing, I need to do that. So I did what I normally do. And I said, so this is what I need to do. And I got on it and I just started to write down stuff that I thought that I needed to take a look at. And some is good, some is bad. But I ran across this verse. There's a verse in Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. And it says this is what the Lord says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. And then the last part of the verse says, but they said, we will not walk in it. So they did what we tend to do and said, we're not going to do that. But basically, he's saying, you're kind of at a crossroads. You're kind of at a place of rest. He says, stop, just stop for a moment and look and ask. Don't just jump in and do. You need to ask where the ancient paths are and where the good ways are. And then when I tell you and I show you, walk in it, do it, live in it, and you will find rest for your souls. You will find what you're looking for. But you need to stop and you need to ask and you need to look. And that's when I realized that we don't stop and ask a lot. We're full of our own stuff. We should not ask ourselves. We should not rely upon ourselves. And this is where the death to self comes from. This is where the searching for you, but to search for you, to want to know what you have to say, I have to be quiet. I have to take the thoughts. Again, I don't know about you, but I've got many, many thoughts in my head about what we ought to be doing. And they may or may not be good, or they may be good, but with a tweak of God. God needs to inject it with some kingdom stuff, whatever. But I need to lay that stuff down. I have to lay it down with the caveat that I may not ever pick it up again. That's death to self. Even what I think is a good plan, I need to be ready to put it down and say, God, you are king of this creation. You are over everything. You have what I need to hear. You have everything I need. And yes, there will be things. Again, what's the first thing he says? Ask for the ancient paths. There's wisdom in the past. There is things that we have disregarded, but he says, hey, you need to go back there. But he also says, and there's new things. I'll show you. There are good ways to go. Jesus says the wise scribe is the one who goes back when he's talking about the life in this kingdom, and he pulls out old and new stuff out of his closet and lives this life. But this whole idea of us needing to put down our stuff in order to hear what he has to say brought me back to a couple of quotes by G.K. Chesterton. One I mentioned a few weeks ago, and maybe it was SOCOM. I know it was on the Thursday night group. But this, G.K. Chesterton, now this was written in 1922, so this is 100 years ago. So this is, a lot of times I read these quotes and I know people are thinking, it's almost like Katie talking about, this is what Martin Luther said about the pandemic back then, but you could have, somebody just wrote that this year because of the pandemic. And it's things haven't changed. We go through the same things over and over. But G.K. Chesterton wrote this. He said, the reformer, because that's what I want to reform the church. I want to go back to its roots. The reformer is always right about what is wrong, and he is generally wrong about what is right. The reformer is always right about what is wrong. He is generally wrong about what is right. Meaning, yeah, we can point out the bad stuff. Oh man, you shouldn't treat like that. But we really don't know what to replace it with. We don't know what. We're good at tearing down. We're good at. You look around the country, young people think, these things are bad, so we tear it down. But there's nothing to replace it except graffiti now, and pretty soon our world's going to look like Mad Max, because we're good at tearing things down and destroying it, but it's going to be just these ruins with tagging and stuff all over it, and maybe a saying here they're spray painted on a wall. But this is important for me because I have to realize I like to be thought. I like to think of myself as a reformer. I want to find out what it's really about, and so I can point out the things that are wrong. But it's coming up with the things that are right, which I'm not really good at, but God is. And then along the same lines, he says this, he says, I believe what really happens in history is this: the old man is always wrong. And the young people are always wrong about what is wrong with the old man. So the old man's always wrong, and then all the people coming up are always wrong about what he's wrong about. The practical form it takes is this: that while the old man may stand by some stupid custom, the young man always attacks it with some theory that turns out to be equally stupid. And so that is the story of mankind. That's what he's talking about, history. And that's basically, I'm the old man now, so I've got wisdom, I think. And but the thing is that the people that come behind me will just discard my stupidity and replace it with their own stupidity. And that's not a cut on the younger people, because 40 years ago, I was a young man doing that exact same thing. I wasn't listening to the paths, the ancient paths. I wasn't even looking for them. I didn't want anything to do with them, and I just cast them aside. So that for me was a good place of grounding me, of saying, every time, at least at this moment, every time I say this is what I need to do, I need to put that aside. I need to die to myself, and I need to ask God. I need to say, I need to take time asking God. I need to take time hearing God. Another quote, many people know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was. Lutheran pastor, German Lutheran pastor, who during the Second World War, beginning of the Second World War, he had gotten out before things got really bad. It was in England. I think he was pastoring a church or teaching in a seminary or something, and he realized, I'm German. I'm a Christian. I had to be back in Germany trying to help the Christians in Germany learn how to navigate through what is going on in our country. And so he left England, which on one hand, at that point wasn't being bombed yet. So it was like he left safety to go back into Germany before everything got really bad. And he began a underground seminary where he took 23 people and they lived together. And out of living together, he wrote a short book, but profound book called Life Together. And in a quote, speaking about community, speaking about learning to live together as the body of Christ, of which the book is about, he writes this. He says, the person who loves their dream of community will destroy community. The person who loves their dream of community will destroy community, but the person who loves those around them will create community. And the thing is that when we bring our ideas of what the church or church life or Christian life ought to be about, we destroy the church. Now, there's a level of degrees. You might destroy the church by because you don't like something, you don't like the way things are done, or you don't understand it, or it doesn't make sense to you, or doesn't touch you. Because of course, when church is about us, right? We go to worship God, but we ask ourselves, how was church? Meaning, how did you like church? What did you get out of it? And if instead of asking, I wonder if God liked church today? I wonder if God liked our worship today. And so there's this sense of it might just be, I don't understand that, so I'm not going to engage with what's going on because I don't. When they do that, when they sing and sing's not that good, or they sing the wrong songs, or the preacher, that guy, every once in a while he's okay, but he's pretty boring, or whatever it is. When our ideas take precedence over being there and us offering ourselves as a sacrifice, dying to ourselves and saying, I'm part of your kingdom, God. So what I may not understand, I may not like what's going on because it doesn't fit me. I don't like those shoes. I don't like the color of that shirt. Then I'm just not going to engage. So that's one level of working against the church, of destroying the church. They can work all the way up to the guy I told a story about last week that basically for power's sake, and because he had more power in the church, he actually caused the church split. But there's so many things that we do that really fall under the category of Jesus appearing to Saul before he was Paul on the road to Damascus and saying, knocking him down off the horse and saying, what are you doing? You're kicking against the goads. And the goads was just a farming thing that they would roll over on the ground, and it had like needles going a certain way. It would aerate the ground or something like that. But it's meant to go one way because of the way the needles are facing. He says to kick against the goads was to hurt. You're hurting yourself, but you're also working against me. You're working against me. You're doing what you think ought to be done instead of listening to what I think ought to be done. And it's hurting you and it's hurting the church. And so, like I said, I've got all this stuff here. So if I love, so there's a thing about death. There's a thing about death itself. We can talk about Bonhoeffer. He ended up actually dying. And it was said of him that, well, here, this is, if you don't know the story, he was actually a pacifist, and he changed his, as Germany grew and kept doing stuff. People were trying to get him to join their little escapades of plans of getting Hitler out of the way, and that usually meant killing him. There's a lot of attempts on Hitler's life that did not work. And he would never join in because he was a pacifist. And finally, in his mind, and again, not saying it right or wrong, but in his mind, he came to the conclusion of, if there was a rabid dog loose on the street, would I not take out that rabid dog so that it didn't hurt people? And so he joined one of these plans that fell through, and he got arrested because it didn't work. And he got thrown in jail. And Hitler, at the time of when he went to his bunker to commit suicide, he kind of did the anti-pardon thing. Like presidents, when they leave office, they pardon 100 people for various things. Well, Hitler did and I guess maybe tyrants do this. They did an anti-pardon, and he left a list of people. He said, these people need to die. These are the people that they were my enemies, and they need to die. And Bonhoeffer was on that list. And so one of the last people on the list was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so people who were with him in the prison camp tell about this guy in the face of death and going to death, how he approached it as one would hope a Christian would approach it. He was okay with it. He was already dealt with death. He already knew death to self is just degrees all the way to laying down your life for a friend. But it was said about him, as confidence in God does in all who possess it. It not only transformed the way that Bonhoeffer died, but it transformed the way that he lived. He lived without fear, a life without lack, a life without fear. He lived without thought of his life because he had died to himself. When death becomes a gateway into all that is good, pleasant, and glorious, then doing hard things that subject one's life, are no longer risky endeavors. When fear of death is removed, obedience is not only possible, it is prioritized. And so there's this, here's somebody who had grown in this idea of death to the self, all the way to the point of he didn't even mind if he was talking about losing his physical life. Forget about the color of the pews in the church, or what's being served at the potluck, or what songs being sung on Sunday morning. But he's talking about all the way to the point of death. And the thing is that if we learned, I mean, that's the story that we've been learning, a life without fear, a life without lack, a life without fear. Again, if I love my life, I'll lose it. And if I lose my life, I'll gain it. That's what Jesus said. And I need to trust Jesus, because faith comes in. I need to trust that what he says is right, that he knows what he's talking about, and that laying down our lives, laying down our ideas, our opinions, our desires, for the sake of God and for the sake of our neighbors is the way to go. Now, that leads me into a story I'll finish right before my conclusion. But this is a story, again, I've been picking up all these books and reading. Some of them would bore you. Maybe I've already bored you, but this book, if you haven't got it, it was, especially in the vineyard, it's a great book to have. It's called The Way In is the Way On. And it's basically, they've taken writings and sermons from John Wimber and put the most important ones, the ones that talk about what are most important in here. And it's really good to get his insight on stuff. And again, if you don't know the history of the vineyard, one of the things that the vineyard was famous for was worship. And they basically have not transformed the face of the entire church, but they have affected the church as a whole for the positive. What most people in churches that we would associate with or think of being church, we're not, not necessarily going to the Catholic Church, but I'm sure even in the Catholic Church, they now sing, not just sing the songs, but do worship in a different way than it was done 40 or 50 years ago. And it was because of Vineyard's influence. And John Wimber, again, you got the story, you always see the successes. You always see Vineyard. I remember before I was Vineyard, I would look at ads in the paper and stuff for churches, and they wouldn't be Vineyard, but they say Vineyard style worship. That's what they say. We have Vineyard style worship. And the thing is John Wimber, he was a musician, and you would expect, shouldn't surprise us that worship was a big deal to him. Now, he was a musician, he was famous, he was a songwriter and member of the Righteous Brothers, and worked in Vegas, and that was his career, and he was very, very good at it. And it was at that time, and he was in the midst of that, he became a Christian, and God called him to leave the entertainment industry because it was not good for him. It's run by Satan, and he could see that, and God called him out of that. And he wouldn't say, nobody would say that doesn't mean that God may not call you into it, but he had to be removed from it. And that took a lot of dying. If you can imagine, you've given your life to something to the point where you're that good at something that right? I mean, it's not just me who was a inventory control guy. I did that for a job, but this was his life. This was his love. And God called him to leave it all behind. He basically stepped down from the group, and then was asked to join again because they had been asked to be the opening band for the Beatles. You might have heard of the Beatles, right? And he said, I can't do it. God told me not to, and so he didn't do that. And so this little story is Carol Wimber, John's wife, telling a story. This is in a chapter about worship, but it goes to this place of dying to yourself, to finding out what God has for you. This is what it looks like. Again, we see the successes, but many, many times we don't see the death to self that goes before that. So this is Carol's, in the midst of this chapter, she tells a story. She says, She says, we must worship because we are body and spirit, just as we need to nurture our body by giving it food and drink. Worship feeds and refreshes our spirit. Vineyard worship is all over the world now, and it changed the face of the church. People used to be called, quote, song leaders, but now they're called, quote, worship leaders. The big thing was that John's thing was, you don't sing songs at the beginning to warm people up for the message. Worship and by singing is worship in itself. And I think that we kind of understand that. But back then, that was a new idea. Many years ago, when we were baby Christians and John was out of work, Christmas was approaching and we were out of money. The Lord told John to quit his job, so he quit. Soon after he quit, he was offered a good paying position at Disney. They lived in Anaheim. By placing their different bands and groups, something John would have been good at. But Sheldon, our pastor, didn't think this was a good plan, being part of the entertainment industry again. So John declined the offer. It's Christmas, you're out of money, you got kids, you're offered a great job in Disney. You turn it down because it would be getting you back into what God's called you out of. Months had gone by and we had nothing until one evening, Bill Medley, he's one of the Righteous Brothers, if you remember them. Bill Medley called from the UK where their band, the Righteous Brothers, had gone with the Beatles as a warm-up group. And Bill wanted John to produce a Christmas album, which you would think, Christian Christmas album. John would have loved to do that. And not only that, but he would have had total freedom to do it any way he wanted. It seemed perfect, an answer to our prayers. They would send us a $5,000 deposit right away. $5,000 in the 60s. It's like $100,000 now, right? A house, you can buy a house for $25,000. John said he would call back. He told me what was going on and asked me what I thought. And I wanted him to take it just because we needed the money. In my heart, though, I also thought it could be a trap. John thought so too, like the devil was trying to buy him back. There's an understanding that the devil's at work here. I have to take that into consideration. We prayed, and John called back Bill's wife because he didn't have the heart to talk to Bill himself. And he told her to thank Bill for the offer, but he wasn't going to be able to do it. It was then that he went out and got a job at a machine shop. I don't know what they manufactured, but I do know that two men got their hands crushed in the machines at the job. And here was John, a musician. He was cleaning the oil drums when an old friend came by and asked where his office was. John had to admit that the oil drum was his office. And the guy just looked at John in horror and disgust and said, "What are you doing here, man? Have you lost your mind?" John said, "Yeah, I have lost my mind, and I don't ever plan on getting it back." He sold all of his horns except one, which he saved to trade for a painting he knew I wanted. And then that Saturday, he went through every closet, every cupboard, and every shelf where he kept his lifetime of work. He then cleared off the piano and cleaned out the piano bench. All of his award-winning arrangements, jazz records, and reference records. He took his wonderful music, years of work, and he placed it all in cardboard boxes and loaded them into our station wagon and drove up to the garbage dump on the mountain. He opened the back of the wagon and started pushing those boxes out of the rear of the car, shoving them out with his foot. A lifetime of work, sinking down into the mud and the garbage. He didn't talk at all. He didn't say a thing. My heart ached for him, but I've never been so proud to be his wife as I was that night. I prayed silently that God would do something beautiful someday through John and music that would be pleasing to God. And I recalled the verse from John where Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." That is what I believe has happened. I believe the seeds of worship were planted in the vineyard when John's music sunk into the mud of the garbage dump. It was total and complete abandonment to the will of God. And I think that that's the kind of death to self that God is asking for during this time when we've been put on hold. And he's saying, stop and look and ask me. And it might not come like that. It might take weeks, months, maybe years. But there's a sense of following God's ways, the ancient paths, and asking for what the good ways are, that he will lead us where he wants us to be. And we will eventually be glad that we did that, even though, again, you go through that story, there were levels of dying, there were levels of saying no to jobs, saying no to things that he would be good at, going out and getting a job where he could get hurt. And even at that point, what does he do? He goes out and he cleans out all the stuff and gets rid of it. And that just said, there's no going back. And yet, again, God would, there are probably stories of people who did that and they're still working in the machine shop now. They retired, raised their, didn't start movements, didn't become, great worship people, just were people following Jesus. And they gave up a lot, but that's what he's called them to. And we have to remember that this is his church, his creation. He knows how things are to run and what the best way to do things are. Now, I just want to conclude this again. I think why I'm talking about this is because of things that I can see that talking about in the future, at least in the near future. Again, I'm not doing a series, but I think it's a theme that we need to keep this in mind, that this is God telling us, saying, you need to stop, just stop. And as you've cleaned out your closets of stuff or your garage or whatever, you've purged some stuff and you've gotten rid of some stuff, that's what I'm doing. But you need to bring me into the equation, and you need to make me the number one person that you are listening to, and we will come out where we want to be. This is just like 2 paragraphs. John, this is a chapter where he's talking about God moving in crazy ways, and why and how he allows things to go, how he leads that. But he says this, he says, one of the basic goals I had in mind when this whole thing started early on in the Vineyard movement was this. I don't know if that's making, if you're hearing noise, Rachel's up with, we have 4 Labradors in the hallway right outside, and their tails bang the wall. So it's not a plane hitting our house. It's Rachel walking by with 4 dogs. This wakes me up every day, every morning. So he says the basic goals he had in mind, one of them was this: what would God do if we gave him the chance? It reminds me of D.L. Moody, the evangelist from the 1800s, said, what would God do with a man who gave himself 100% wholly to him? And then he tried to be that man. In this, it was more about, this is who we are as a church. What would God do if we gave him the chance? What if fear or self-interest doesn't restrict us? Self-interest, what I want. What if the need for control didn't overwhelm us? What would God do if our own ministries were not the most important issues? If the things that I want to see in church, the things that feed me and make me feel good, wasn't the most important issue? What would it be like if, quote, church wasn't all about us, our place, and our ways, but instead was about Jesus and what he wanted to do here on earth? What would he reveal of his heart? What if it didn't matter to us at all what was said about us, good or bad, and the only opinion that mattered was Jesus's? What would it be like? What if we loved what Jesus loved? What if we let God be God and we just be his people? What if self-protection was not the issue and we didn't care about looking foolish? What would God do? Don't you want to know? Don't you want to find out? We only have these few short years to make decisions of self-sacrifice and faith, death to self and faith. Then the consummation of the ages will arrive and it'll be too late. I pray that the Vineyard and all churches who have a heart to seek and respond to God would become supple in the hands of our loving Father. And so, like I said, kind of a freestyle. I think that I just wanted to kind of put that out there as a thing that God might have us all be thinking about, being open to, maybe having to look at our own self in our own, how would I answer that question? What would the perfect church look like? And then to put the things that we wrote down on a piece of paper and put it over on the side, and then say, God, what is on your piece of paper? And that may or may not be that the things that are on that list may or may not make that cut, or they may need to be tweaked, infused with the presence of God or his love or some other aspect. But I think that as we go into maybe spending the rest of our lives trying to grow in the things that we've just been talking about in this kingdom life, that part of the death to self part is us saying, okay, so God seems to have stopped the world and said, come and ask and look for the things that are wise from the past that maybe have been torn down, that need to be rebuilt, and what is new that I'm giving you today to go and be and to do. That's, I don't have a pithy end, but so trust Jesus, love, do good, and wash your hands. How's that? So at this point, it's 11:34 by my computer clock. We can open it up for 15 minutes or so of if anybody's got a comment or a question or anything else, and if not, that's fine as well. So I don't know. So go. 1, 2, 3. Hold your hands up.